Hey, welcome to Echoes from the Satellite. I'm Karen. Today I want to talk about an author that used to be one of my favorites. Well, still might be one of my favorites, but I hadn't read in a long time. And I'm talking about Roger Zelazny. So, Roger Zelazny was very active in the late 60s and the 70s, somewhat in the 80s as well, but probably best known for his work in the 70s. Um, I have to say that when I started watching BookTube, I was pleasantly surprised to see a number of folks talking about Roger Zelazny because when I was younger, and Zelazny was one of my favorite authors, and people would say, "Oh, who do you like? Who are you reading?" And I would bring up Zelazny. Oftentimes, I would get this puzzled reaction, like, "Who? Who's Roger Zelazny?" So I would have to explain, and mention some of the books that I really liked by Zelazny. And so, I'd bring up uh, the Amber Chronicles. I would bring up Lord of Light, which is probably my favorite book by Zelazny. And, it just seemed like a lot of folks out there, even people who were reading fantasy and science fiction at the time, didn't seem to be that aware of him. Um, Happily, it seems like there's more recognition of his work now. I see a lot of folks talking about him on YouTube. Um, for those of you who may not be that aware of him, Zelazny, um, as I said, wrote the Amber Chronicles, Lord of Light, Creatures of Light and Darkness, a lot of short stories that were collected, and I'm going to be talking about one of those today. He was very recognized by his peers. He won 3 Nebula Awards and 6 Hugos. So this is a writer who was really acknowledged as an excellent writer of both fantasy and science fiction. And I think his work always seemed to straddle that line a bit. There were elements of science fiction, I think, that dipped into his fantasy and vice versa, which I find fascinating. And maybe one of these days we'll do an episode talking about sort of those writers or those works that kind of cross over both fantasy and science fiction. One of the first books, or the first book that I read by Zelazny was this book, although this is not the version. I'll put up the cover of the version I read. But the first book I read by Zelazny was a fantasy novel called Jack of Shadows. And really, I think it's a novella. It's extremely slim. But this was a fantasy book, and it's also on that list of books in the back of the Dungeon Master's Guide. And I'll put up the cover of the book that I read. The version of Jack of Shadows that I read, I got from our public library when I was a young teen, and it was my introduction to Zelazny. And I have to say, I haven't reread it in a very long time, but it was an incredibly trippy book. So it was one of his more out there books. But at that same time, it was kind of the time in my life when I was reading a lot of crazy stuff. I was also reading, I think that was when I first started reading some of Michael Moorcock's Elric stories, and also dipping heavily into in comics, in Jim Starlin's Adam Warlock and Doctor Strange and stuff like that. So psychedelic stuff was right up my alley. But today we're going to talk about a short story collection. Well, it's actually 3 stories with a common protagonist, and that is Roger Zelazny's My Name is Legion. So this is an interesting book. I picked this up probably a few months ago. I'd love for you to take a look at this cover and guess who did the artwork. I was quite surprised when I figured out who did the artwork. I'll give you a second there. It's not a terribly exciting back cover. Um, but do you have any thoughts on who did this artwork? I'll tell you. The brothers Hildebrandt. Yes, I was really surprised. And when I looked at it some more, I could kind of see their work there. Um, I think we tend to think that they only did fantasy, but they also did science fiction. So that was kind of amusing. Um, so this is a collection that came out originally 1976. And as I said, it has 3 stories. And so there's a protagonist in this, an unnamed protagonist, who essentially, and I should say this is science fiction, it takes place in the future, an unnamed future, although it feels very near future. So it feels like it could happen, you know, just a few decades away, that sort of thing. Almost to me, it gave me almost like a Blade Runner kind of feel, but not really. There's nothing in it that's from Blade Runner, but it had that same sort of maybe noir feel because the protagonist is a investigator. He almost feels like a secret agent, but he's really an investigator. And the setup is that originally he was a programmer, a computer programmer, and he was part of a group that was working on creating this, what he called a data bank, but what we would probably think of as, you know, a global network where everyone's identity would be stored and everyone's record from, you know, your identity records, your medical records, your, you know, legal records, whatever, would all be connected and stored in this central data bank. Now, mind you, this was written in 1969. Okay, this first story in here, 1969. So at that time, you know, the ARPANET project was just starting with the internet. That was just rolling around. And I know personally, my experience, my first experience with the internet was on my college campus. And I think that was I think it was called ARPANET then. It might have been part of the NSF project. It might have been like NSFNet. But they had, somebody said, hey, come check this out in the library. So I go over and they had these terminals and they were really clunky old terminals, but it was like top of the line stuff then. And you could go and it was like, wow, you can type in things and talk to people on other college campuses. And that was in the 80s. So, you know, for Zelazny to be talking about, you know, a global network that stored all of our records and, you know, could be shared across the planet. And I don't know, I find it impressive that he was thinking about this stuff in the 60s. So anyway, the protagonist is working on this and he starts to think that maybe it's not such a good idea. Maybe it's not a great thing. Now, at this point, you might think, oh, he's going to disable it, he's going to destroy it, he's going to do something to save the rest of humanity. No, he just finds a way to extract his own data out of the data bank, right? Out of the network. So by doing so, he becomes sort of the guy who never existed. He has no identity. He's a null and void, right? So he doesn't exist. And therefore, he's able to kind of live off of the grid, right? He's not pulling a Unabomber thing here, but he's living off of the grid. And then he takes on these projects, these missions for this detective agency. And he can basically, with the skills he has, he can take on any identity he wants and go investigate things. And that's how he sort of makes his living. A couple of times a year, he'll take on these cases, make a whole bunch of money, and then just, you know, essentially be a bum. And so that's the basis that, you know, is behind all of the stories. And so 3 stories in the book. The first one is called The Eve of RUMOLO. And like I said, this one was written in 1969. All of the stories in the book were appeared somewhere else originally, I should say. And so this story, I've got my notes here, so you're going to have to forgive me while I look at my notes. The first story, Eve of RUMOLO, appeared in a book called 3 for Tomorrow, which I think was edited by Roger Silverberg, and that was from 1969. And so the first story is about our character being hired to prevent sabotage on this project where they're trying to raise these islands from like underground volcanoes. It's essentially about having more space for a large population. And there's sabotage of the project, and he is preventing the sabotage. But there's also a lot of political undertones about, is it wrong or right to be doing this, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's definitely got a lot of action to it. Um, Definitely feels very almost James Bond-like in what's going on. There is a really prolonged torture scene in there, um, where he is first the person being tortured and then turns the tables and becomes the torturer, which is kind of funny. This first story, though, the one thing that drove me absolutely up the wall, and it's, I think, about 63 pages long. It seemed like every other page, the dude was referencing smoking. I'm not a smoker. I'm not, I don't want to smoke or be around people smoking. But this guy, and I know that Zelazny himself was a smoker, and it was 1969, so it was a very different world back then. I actually counted it up. I have my card here. I counted in the 63-page story 10 different occurrences of him mentioning either lighting up or smoking. And, over the course of 63 pages, that's a lot. But it was a good story. It was an entertaining story, and I enjoyed it. The second story in the book uh, is also entertaining. It has a name that is basically unpronounceable because it is in a dolphin language. It has a lot of K's and L's and J's in it. And it was originally in a collection of stories called An Exaltation of Stars, Transcendental Adventures in Science Fiction from 1973. So you can go out and find that somewhere. And that one was really interesting too, where he was given a mission to discover who had murdered this person on an island. It was a research station. It involved, there were dolphins around the station, and somehow the actual killer had made it look like dolphins had killed this person while they were scuba diving. I don't want to get too much into the details, but um, there's some really trippy discussions about dolphins and culture and intelligence that was pretty interesting stuff. So that's there, but he also brings a lot of action to it as well. So yeah, another really cool adventure story there. And then the final story in the book is called Home is the Hangman. Now, Home is the Hangman appeared in Analog in 1975, the Analog magazine, and this actually won Hugo for best novella. And so, Home is the Hangman is about the return of a robot. Essentially, he essentially refers to it as an AI, although he doesn't necessarily use terms that we would use nowadays. But it's an autonomous robot who was sent into space to planets to um, carry out missions on other worlds, and uh, this robot returns to Earth, and this robot has a vendetta essentially against the folks who had a hand in creating it. And it's again, it's a really interesting um, like murder mystery. This shows a lot of the versatility I think that Zelazny had. I have no doubt that if he had wanted to just write crime stories or murder mysteries, he probably could have done that. I think he's a very talented author. Um, but yeah, it's another one where it's more than what it seems to be, right? And so I don't want to give away too much because I think folks will want to read it. So let me just say that it's another one where I think you'd be surprised by what's actually happening behind the scenes. And so I can give this a very big thumbs up. Can give this whole book a big thumbs up. I think the last story is probably the best, although I really enjoyed the middle story with the dolphins quite a bit. Um, yeah, it's a quick read. It's only 200 and 205 pages, so it's depending on which version you get. Now, the funny thing is, I sat down, I started reading this, and when I got into the torture scene in the first story, I said, God, this seems really familiar. And I looked around, and I'll put up this cover on the screen here. I know that I actually read this many years ago, probably when I was a teenager, because the cover you see on the screen, I'm sure that I either had this book or I checked this book out from the library, but I probably haven't read it since I was either in my teens or my 20s. So anyway, I didn't remember anything other than like, oh yeah, I remember these dolphins. And then when I saw the alternate cover, I remembered having it. But anyway, it was a great read. The stories are all different, but all very interesting and a lot of fun. So if you just want something from Zelazny, and I don't feel like this is necessarily stereotypical Zelazny, but I think the fact that um, there's always more than what you think is going on in these stories, that is very typical of Zelazny. But these stories are very much, I would say, straightforward science fiction. You know, I just told you a few minutes ago, oh, he always blends fantasy and science fiction. Well, not so much in this case. So this is a little unusual, but I think it's a good read. And if you're interested in checking out how Zelazny does science fiction, I think this is a good book to pick up. So that is my take on this. And I think at some point here, I will probably go back and reread probably Lord of Light. But there's one book of his that I know I haven't read, which I know is in high esteem, and that's This Immortal. And so I need to get my hands on that. So I'll be keeping my eyes out to see if I can find that anywhere. That's one I just haven't come across. So that will be on my list of things to find when I'm out there looking for books. Anyway, that pretty much wraps it up for this go round. I hope you enjoy the episode, and please let me know if you've read this book, what your thoughts are on it, or your thoughts on Zelazny in general. I'd really love to hear what other people think about Zelazny's work. So anyway, thanks again for watching. I appreciate the comments and likes and subscriptions. And stay safe, stay strong, and I will see you next time.